Welcome back in, Sons of the Shoe. Spencer German with you, riding solo once again this week. But I wasn't solo for that first segment, and I thought it was awesome. Again, Alec Dietz, who again covers Oregon for the Eugene Register Guard, and I thought he was awesome. I thought he was awesome. Like getting into just all the nitty gritty details of Oregon coming into the Big Ten. I think he was being like honest about. I loved the question I asked about, not to like toot my own horn here, about my amazing Howard Stern like questioning, but I loved my question about just is the Big Ten in for a bigger adjustment against Oregon, or Oregon in a bigger adjustment for the Big Ten? I think that is truly like one of the big stories about this whole realignment thing, because as much as you look at it and you say Oregon coaches poll came out this week, they're number 3, right? And you think, okay, they're going to roll their way through the Big Ten. It's going to be easy. These Big Ten teams surprise even some of the better Big Ten teams, right? Like we brought up Iowa in that conversation in Kinnick Stadium and how that can be a tough place to play. And, Alec brought up like they got to play in Madison at some point this year. Like you roll into some of these stadiums and it can be a scare. Like you just never know what's going to happen. And it's a different environment. It's a different style of football in some ways. And I do think like he emphasized that Oregon's defense isn't maybe as bad or isn't getting enough credit for being better. And I think a lot of that is like the blanket statements made about the Pac-12, right? We've spent so many years dogging on the Pac-12 because they don't play defense, or they don't have as good of defenses out there. The Big 12 is the one that really plays no defense. Pac-12 was kind of like a close second, where it was like a lot of high octane offenses, and the defenses, depending on who you were playing, were hit or miss. But like think about like Utah, they're scoring all these points. USC had a terrible defense last year, despite having Caleb Williams on offense and the best quarterback in football, arguably. So like that's always been a bugaboo for them. But he was saying Oregon's defense is better than they're getting credit for, so that's good from Oregon standpoint. But again, you go in and you get pushed around by a more physical Wisconsin team or a more physical Iowa team or whatever, and you just never know. So I do think it's going to be an adjustment both ways. But what's interesting too is like because Ohio State is a similar team to Oregon, it's almost like I think about Oregon losing games to some teams that normally you wouldn't think they would, and that Ohio State is actually a more advantageous matchup to them. And because they're going to be very similar. Now, Ohio State's defense might be better, but because of how just star-studded they are, and the secondary calling themselves best in America with the guys that they have, and Burke and obviously Caleb Downs joining the fold as a transfer, and others. So there's always the possibility that is true, but like I think it is going to be a little bit of a wake-up call for that side of the ball, specifically for Oregon. And I don't think it's just going to be this cakewalk, even if they go out to beat Ohio State, because I do think Ohio State they'll be a better matchup for them because they play similar styles, and that's more what they're used to. So we know in sports, man, like sometimes you might be the best team or you might have the best team, and that doesn't always matter when push comes to shove, because sometimes it's about matchups. And if you get the right matchup on a certain day, sometimes that allows you to win, even if you lose to other teams. But yeah, watching that unfold is going to be fascinating. The Dylan Gabriel stuff was fascinating, just how he's, in the mix or the top option in Vegas for the Heisman, and he's got so much talent around him, so it makes a lot of sense. And conversely, Ohio State has a transfer quarterback of their own that they're trying to sort of build this offense around, so I think that's going to be interesting, and something that will obviously follow throughout the season. And then I do think too that you have I love that he gave credence to what I've been saying for several weeks now about this potential matchup. And it's funny, I said it during the conversation, but as we got more and more into it, it was like you just kept finding more and more parallels between Ohio State and Oregon. Whether it's Carlos Loughlin joining Ohio State staff after he was on Oregon staff, whether it's the fact that they play similar styles, they both have very high-octane offenses, really good receivers, and they're going to score a lot of points on you. They both have transfer quarterbacks who are coming in from different schools more out west or in the Midwest. Like the similarities are endless, and that I think just adds to the intrigue of these two teams when they get to meet on October 12th in Eugene at Autzen Stadium, with a chance to really see how it all kind of transpires in the football field. And then you throw in, like I mentioned, chance to see them maybe 2, if not 3 times in a season, or those 2 teams to meet 2 or 3 times in the season. That's pretty damn remarkable. And I'm telling you, if that happens, if they see each other twice, like Big Ten championship game plus the regular season matchup, or even, and take a step further, if they see each other 3 times, you could end this season feeling like it already is like a huge rivalry in the Big Ten. And that's what's exciting about the implications of expansion. You get some new different matchups. And I understand tradition matters to fan bases in this sport. And so, yeah, you're losing Oregon State. And you lose some of these teams that you've been more associated with over the years because you're not in the Pac-12 anymore. And that does stink. Like, I feel sorry for some of those fan bases that their teams aren't joining some of these 2 mega conferences, or that they've kind of gotten left behind, and just what that all means for the future and rivalries and all these different things. I do feel for those fan bases. But in terms of like the Big Ten, you're going to get some new rivalries out of this. You're going to get some really good matchups out of this. You're going to get some fun, just I think games in general with great storylines and great theater on the football field that we can all enjoy. So I'm looking forward to all that. And like I said, if you get to the end of the season and Ohio State and Oregon somehow, some way meet 3 times in a season, 3 times, we'll be sitting here saying like, yeah, that's a rivalry, especially if like they split a little bit. Like if it's like maybe Oregon wins in the regular season, Ohio State wins, and Oregon wins again, or vice versa. I know if that happened, I think it would be a doomsday scenario where we'd be asking, or a lot of people would be saying Ryan Day should be fired. But he's getting asked to be fired, or he's being urged to be fired for less. So wouldn't be that bad in the grand scheme of things, because people want him fired if he looks the wrong way at a fan. Like, I don't know, if he breathes funny. But regardless, I digress. Yeah, like this Oregon Ohio State thing could really snowball into something bigger. Like, we're just talking about it now, but by the end of the season, it could be already something that we're talking about as like the next big matchup, or the second biggest matchup for them every single year in this conference. So a lot of fun stuff. I'm glad that Alex was able to join us, and I look forward to getting him back on in the lead up to that game, sort of previewing things coming up to October 12th. And I'm sure Nick will be on with us then, and he'll be able to ask some questions and do some fun things with him. So I'm very, very much looking forward to doing that with Nick. And having Alec back at some point. I do want to pivot and give some time to the big story this week from the NCAA and college football, other than the coaches poll coming out and the Pitbull story, which I will get to. I will get to the Pitbull thing coming up here in a little bit. But we'll do that in 4 Down territory, by the way. But I want to get to this because we talk about parallels between 2 programs. And it is kind of interesting that all of a sudden Michigan finds itself in a very similar situation, or more specifically, Jim Harbaugh finds itself in a very similar situation to what Jim Tressel found himself in 2011 for the Terrell Pryor selling of obviously the improper benefits is what they called it, but the fact that they were selling merchandise, selling apparel and all that different stuff, selling their gold pants and all that, and they got in trouble for it. And Terrell Pryor obviously got suspended, and Jim Tressel was given at that time a 4-year show cause from the NCAA, which basically means, okay, in order for a team to hire him, they have to show cause as to why they're hiring him, and then he would have had to serve a 6-game suspension if he returned to college football. And so at that time, and this is where it gets really interesting, at that time, he went to the NFL to be a consultant with the Colts that next year. And Roger Goodell stood by the NCAA's ruling and said, okay, he's going to be suspended 6 games. He had to serve that 6-game suspension in the NFL. And there's all these connections between, well, the obvious things are like the college football is basically like a free farm system for the NFL. So I think in the past, they have really leaned into okay, if you do something, if you say something, we are going to enforce it because we want this partnership to be strong and continue and whatever. You're not getting that, it seems like, with the Jim Harbaugh situation right now, because he received Jim Tressel received a 5-year show cause. Jim Harbaugh received a 4-year show cause this time around. And again, this is his punishment for not for the Connor Stallion sign stealing. This is for the recruiting violations during COVID, where he got the cheeseburgers with the players and then lied about it. And that's the thing people have to remember here, because I understand this falls in line with what we said about some of the Connor Stallion stuff, like everyone's stealing signs, whatever. It's not as big of a deal as maybe we've made it. This truly isn't that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. But the problem is that Jim Harbaugh lied, and he's been reportedly not really cooperative with the NCAA in these investigations. And when he was caught in the situation breaking these rules, he lied about it and said he didn't do it. That's the thing that's getting him in trouble now, because he lied about it. I think if he had been up front, the punishment probably wouldn't be this severe. And so we can go into whether or not we think the NCAA is just a sham, weak, timid organization anyway that really doesn't have any power behind it, and whether or not any of this actually matters. But what's interesting about that is 13 years after the fact, 13 years after Jim Tressel's situation, which again, very, very similar. He leaves to the NFL, and the NFL upheld that suspension. It doesn't sound like the NFL is going to do the same thing with Jim Harbaugh. They were asked about it and basically declined to comment on if there's a precedent set for him this year and this time around. College football's changed since then. And I think that's the biggest thing to keep in mind here is, like, back then, I think the NFL probably looked and said, we want to have a good relationship with the NCAA. Now you have conference realignment. Now you have NIL. Now you have all these different things happening. It sounds like there's at some point going to be the shift to, well, we want just an overarching body to be like the conferences, and everything else will sort of fall in line from there. And then the NCAA can oversee all the other sports, right? Like football is going to be its own entity with its own governing body, sort of ran by the commissioners of these conferences or whatever, of these super conferences or whatever. And it's going to be different. The NCAA has clearly lost power over the last decade plus, to the point where it doesn't even seem like the NFL respects their gravitas, or the power that they supposedly have. And so I don't think Jim Harbaugh is going to get suspended in the NFL. And it's just funny how the situations being similar, they're being handled completely differently, like little over 10 years apart. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. Was there a precedent set? Yeah, it sure seems that way. But things have changed since then. And I don't think, I'm going to be honest, I think it seems stupid that he could get suspended in the NFL. Like, what jurisdiction does the NCAA have in the NFL other than the fact that they are basically a free farm system for the NFL? That's it. But if they're not linked in terms of the organizations like you see in baseball or something like that. So I don't know how that should. To me, it doesn't matter that Jim Harbaugh sought refuge. And to be clear, I think Jim Tressel should have been off the hook too when he sought refuge in the NFL. I think that's all stupid. But it seems ludicrous that they'd actually follow through with this. And I don't think they will, especially because Jim Harbaugh is a polarizing figure in the NFL right now, as one of the more outspoken and sort of fun coaches who says things that get aggregated on social media. And so I don't know that it's really something that is going to carry much weight or carry much water. So it's a fascinating parallel. It is, between the Harbaugh and the Tressel situations. And I understand why Ohio State fans are like, well, he should be suspended too in the NFL, like Jim Tressel was. But I just think because how much college football has changed, and because the NCAA has lost significantly more and more power over the years, I don't know that it's going to have the same result that one did. And I think we just kind of have to live with that, even if it's quote unquote unfair. But yeah, it's fascinating that these, over a decade apart, we're seeing a very similar situation kind of play out with the two biggest rivals in college football and their coaches. Now, the other part I want to get to with Michigan, and we'll sort of wrap this up to get out of this segment and lead you into, obviously, 4 down territory to get us out of here. Got 4 fun topics for you that we'll get to. But the other part of this is the actual side of the actual Connor Stalions sign stealing scandal news that we got last weekend, sort of into start this week. And that all centered around the fact that Sherrone Moore was caught having texted Connor Stalions and then subsequently deleting those texts on the day that reports came out that they were being investigated for this operation that they were conducting. Now, here's what I'm going to say about this. And I said this in our mini-sode that I dropped earlier this week. It was a short, 5-minute mini-sode. You can find it, Sons of the Shoe, wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Odyssey app, Apple Podcasts again, Spotify, but also Apple Podcasts. You can find it there. And at the 92 The Fan YouTube. Well, actually, I take that back. The mini-sode is not on the 92 The Fan YouTube channel, so don't go looking for it there. I digress, though. I'll sum it up by saying this. If you delete texts, you're guilty of something, okay? And the example that I used was if you are texting another woman and you're married, and even if your wife doesn't know, you're doing it behind her back, and you feel like you need to delete those texts to make sure she doesn't see them or find out, you're doing something wrong. You're guilty. You're guilty. And that's how I feel about Sherrone Moore. He was doing something shady, tried to delete it, and because you tried to delete it, you're telling on yourself, you're guilty. And if there's one thing I agree with in terms of punishment that the NCAA can hand out for this specific thing, if it means Sherrone Moore getting suspended, I think that's fine. Because the adults in the room are the ones who are obviously overseeing all this, and they're the ones that have to, I think, answer for the crimes of what was going on, not the players. The bull band stuff is stupid to me. You're punishing the wrong people when you do that. I think you have to punish the coaches and the powers, the people that were in power within the organization. Now, in theory, that would mean Jim Harbaugh because it's his program, and he says he doesn't know what was going on. Fine, whatever. And he's now sought refuge in the NFL, and I think that's also fine. So he got out while he could, and that is what it is. But I do think, if he was back this year, I would say the same thing about him. If you're finding all these details, it was his program. He probably deserves to get suspended again. And I think the same thing should be said about Sherrone Moore here, where if you're going to punish anybody, punish him. If he's the one, if he was part of it, if he was texting about it, if there was stuff that he felt he needed to hide, so he deleted his text messages, he probably deserves to get suspended in some capacity. Now, there's nothing given to him yet. There's still details that are being uncovered. But, Sherrone Moore, you're guilty. And you told on yourself by deleting the messages. And sorry, dude. If you get suspended, I got no sympathy for you. I'm not going to cry crocodile tears for you. Well, I guess I could cry crocodile tears because crocodile tears are fake. So I'll pretend I'm sad. And I'll pull a you, Sherrone Moore. I'll do what you did after the Penn State game about how sad I am that you didn't get a chance to coach your first real game as head coach at Michigan if you get suspended. But I really won't care. Let's take a break. When we get back, we wrap up the show, one final segment with 4 down territory, including what artist name would you want? And this is timely because Ross Bjork talking about maybe selling the naming rights to Ohio Stadium. What artist's name would you want on Ohio Stadium if an artist bought the naming rights? We'll talk about it next. But first, here's a quick word from our sponsors.